spoke about on Friday, I should say, is that the rabbis have the power to make decrees in order to make a fence around the Torah. And the reason why they make those decrees is because they're afraid someone is going to transgress a Torah law, or something negative might come out of the permissibility, and therefore they added prohibitions, which is within their power, to make a fence around the Torah. And this is not called adding or subtracting. We know that there is a prohibition in the Torah that we're not allowed to add or subtract to the Torah. But the rabbis do have the right to make a fence around the Torah by preventing people from sinning and adding a law that's not, they're not claiming it's biblical, because that would be adding onto the Torah if they claim it's biblical. But if they're just saying that it's rabbinic, that we are adding our own law, we're not changing the Torah, we're adding on a rabbinic law. So that is not only allowed, but that's what's expected of the rabbis. The rabbis are meant to preserve the Torah properly. So in the laws of Mamrim, the Rambam brings that the Bezdin that makes a gzeira or a takana, they make a decree or a edict that or establish a custom, and that custom spreads out amongst all of Israel. So the question is, can another Bezdin come and abolish that decree? So in another Bezdin comes afterwards and wants to abolish this earlier decree or institution. So they're not able to unless they are greater than the first Bezdin in wisdom and in numbers. Now, what does that mean? In wisdom and in numbers? In wisdom means that the head of the Sanhedrin, the chief rabbi, has to be greater than the other chief rabbi. And that, of course, is hard for us to evaluate which chief rabbi is greater. But sometimes I guess it is more easy to figure out. I mean, there are everyone has their limitations, their area of expertise. Some rabbis might have more areas of expertise. Other rabbis, might have a lesser area of expertise. And so the head of the Sanhedrin, if a later one is greater than the earlier one in wisdom, that's we explained, and in numbers. Now, the question is, what does it mean numbers? Because the Sanhedrin always has 71 judges. In this way, there's an odd number. 71 judges gives you an odd number so that you could have a majority. And if every Sanhedrin is always 71 judges, how could a later Sanhedrin, a later court, be greater in numbers than the earlier court if they're both the same number, 71? So again, we need two things. In order to abolish a institution or a custom of a prior Bezdin, you need to be greater. The later Bezdin has to be greater than the earlier one in wisdom and numbers. So in wisdom, we said meant that the chief rabbi, the chief justice, is greater in knowledge. And the second thing is it also has to be greater in numbers. So one understanding is greater in numbers means that he's older than the other rabbi was when he made that decree. So if this rabbi is older, he would be able, and he's more wiser, and he's older, then he would be able to abolish it. That could be what it means, numbers. Another understanding what it means, numbers, is has more students. That the later Bezdin has more students, followers, than the earlier Bezdin. And that would mean that it's greater than the earlier court, and you would need both. You need both in order to abolish. But it doesn't end here. Now, if it was
so
greater,
Rabbi, that's to change a rabbinic law, right?
Yeah, but it's not so simple. One second, you got to listen to the next paragraph. Now, if it's greater in wisdom but not in numbers, or if it's greater in numbers and not in wisdom, it can't abolish anything from before, even if the reason of whatever that institution was, even if that doesn't apply anymore, the later one cannot abolish it.
Why not?
One second. So how could you be greater than in numbers if the prior Bezdin is 71 and you're also 71? So the Rambam says these are the amount of scholars that agreed with what the Bezdin established. So this is a third interpretation. I gave you two interpretations of what it means, that the amount in numbers that it's larger. And here they are giving a third interpretation. The Rambam gives a third interpretation, that it means that they are those that agreed with this established, the rabbis throughout the world that agreed with this establishment are a certain number of rabbis. And if the later group of rabbis is larger than it, that would be enough to abolish a prior institution. Now, when does this apply? This applies when it's not meant to be a safeguard for the Torah, but rather as a established rule in the Torah, meaning similar to the Torah, I should say, that the rabbis are making a custom or they are establishing a tradition. For example, what would be an example of this? They established the holiday of Hanukkah or Purim. So this is not a preservation of a law. This is then institution of the rabbis. You have to read the Megillah. You have to light the Hanukkah candles. This is an institution of the rabbis. Now, let's say a later Bezdin wants to say, you know what, Hanukkah, let's do away with it. It's too much. It's already so many years since Hanukkah. Costs too much money for the parents. They have to buy all this oil, and they have to give Hanukkah geld. No, let's do away with Hanukkah. So if the rabbis wanted to do away with Hanukkah, they would need to be greater than the rabbis that established Hanukkah, greater in scholarliness. The chief rabbi who would be making this, abolishing this institution, he would have to be greater than the rabbi who instituted Hanukkah. And the amount of rabbis around the world that agree with him have to be greater in number than there were that agreed with establishing Hanukkah in the first place. So that's how Hanukkah could be abolished. Now we know that it's not going to be abolished. We have a tradition that it's never going to be abolished. But that would be a way that it could theoretically be abolished. Now, however, when something is a decree, when something is a decree, that is to prevent a prohibition in the Torah, so they're making a safeguard around the Torah, then you can never remove the decree at all, even if the later one is greater than the first Bezdin. So that's the words of the Rambam. Now, what is interesting is that there is a responsa from the Chassam Sofer who mentions that this is only when the rationale why the safeguard was instituted still applies. But if the rationale was nullified, then a court that is greater in stature than the previous court, which instituted it, could nullify it. So there is a way to nullify even a decree that's to safeguard the Torah, but that would be only if the rationale doesn't apply anymore. So the question that Edith had asked was, why is that? Why can't a later Bezdin annul a prior Bezdin's institution? And the answer is that they could, as long as, number one, the rationale doesn't apply. Number two, they're greater than the other Bezdin. They have to be greater because they are the ones who are going to knock off this decree and this rule. They have to be greater than the prior Bezdin in wisdom or in numbers. Yes, Yehuda.
Who determines whether they're greater?
Well, I guess maybe the consensus of the Sanhedrin would be if their leader, which one is greater.
Oh, so there has to be a Sanhedrin for this to apply.
Yeah. There has to be a Bezdin that's going to make this that's going to make this consensus.
So that doesn't apply today.
So that's a good question. Does it have to be? What you're asking is, do the rabbis who make this ruling, do they have to be samuch? Do they have to have the real smicha? Nowadays, any rabbi can get smicha from another rabbi. Rabbi gives you smicha, which means they give you the rabbinic ordination. But there used to be a real smicha where you were in a tradition all the way from Moses, that Moses put his hands on Joshua when he gave him smicha, and Joshua gave to the elders and so on. And there was a concept of real smicha in the old days. So what Yehuda's asking is, does this Sanhedrin, this court, need to be the same level as the court in the time of in the olden days when there was real smicha? See, we lost the chain. The chain is broken. So the answer to your question is, Yehuda, even if it does need to be a real smicha, we have a way of reinstituting smicha according to the Rambam. So the Rambam, who's writing this law, also writes about the laws of smicha, and he says that if the majority of rabbis in Israel want to give smicha to someone, they can, and that will be considered the real smicha. And so many rabbis got together and tried to give the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, smicha. I don't know if you know about this. There's a whole historical element to this story. And then in today's day and age, there were many rabbis that wanted to give Rabbi Steinsaltz smicha. Did you know about that? It was very, of course, a very interesting thing, because Rabbi Steinsaltz was a huge scholar, tremendous scholar. He passed away a year or two years ago, but he was an outstanding scholar, and I guess a lot of his students or his colleagues, they felt that maybe he should be given smicha, and ultimately, I don't know if it ever went through or not. There is a way to give smicha to people, and then that person can then go and give others smicha. Yes, Susan.
I have a problem putting a spider web on a cut, because I'm destroying that creature's home. I think that's wrong.
Okay, is that connected to what we're learning?
Yes, that's a very archaic custom, and I feel it should be removed.
Right. I don't know if it's a Jewish thing. We'll have to talk about it another time.
You spoke about it last week.
No, I did hear that.
Putting a worm on a cut? What?
No, a spider web.
Spider
Not a
web?
worm, a spider web.
Did I speak about it, or was it in
Yes.
the laws of Shabbos? Where did you learn about this? In the laws of Shabbos?
I took notes from your
Uh-huh.
from when you were reading the Torah.
Oh, okay. Right.
That one of the things is that
Uh-huh.
putting a
Right.
spider web.
Excuse me, I think it was the rabbi that gave the Shabbat halacha.
Yes,
I
once.
think he talked about the spider.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I apologize, Rabbi.
Okay.
Rabbi, I want to say about Rabbi Cairo, he claimed that he had smicha, but some people didn't accept it.
About who? Who was that?
Rabbi Cairo.
Rabbi Shriver?
Cairo, did you say Rabbi Cairo?
Cairo, Rabbi Cairo.
Cairo, yeah. Rabbi Cairo. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
He
it was a
claimed
big
that he
argument.
had it, but
It was a
some
big
people didn't
argument.
accept it.
Yeah, not everyone wanted to accept it. It was a big argument in his day. The Maharal Bach in the
Yeah.
Mahari Ben Lev, there was a big argument, and there's pages and pages of ink discussing this idea, which is a very innovative idea by the Rambam himself. Like they try to figure out what the source is, but the Rambam writes this about giving smicha and getting smicha. But this is really going off the topic. Yes, Robert.
I think Simone's hand was up first before.
Oh,
mine.
yes, Simone. Okay, yeah. When I don't see the face, that sometimes I
Yeah, no, it's okay. Simone, go ahead.
yes, Simone.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe you want to say a few words about Rabbeinu Gershom and polygamy, just to put it into actual usage?
Not exactly. I don't see how that would apply to this.
Isn't that what he did, that he was able to annul earlier decrees? Men used to be able to marry multiple wives, and then he changed that.
Yeah, but that's adding a decree. That's very simple. Any it's not surprising. Just like we don't have rice on Pesach because the rabbis made a decree against rice, at least in Ashkenazic Jewry. So he made a decree against multiple wives. I mean, it's just like a typical. We don't have muktzah on Shabbos, which is also a decree. These are all the These are just one of the many enactments.
But it was something that was permitted, and then he
Right.
unpermitted
That's
it.
all of the enactments of the rabbis are things that were permitted biblically. And the rabbis felt that we need to have a decree for various reasons, either as a safeguard to Torah law or for another reason. I mean, that would be an example, but I mean, I don't feel it necessary to go into it. It opens up a can of worms. The Sephardic people follow that. It's not necessarily a good topic to bring up. But and then you get into men and women. Why can men have more than one wife, and women can only have one husband? So it's a can of worms. But in any event, it is a example of a decree that rabbis made.
Is
Yes.
Tam's tefillin one of them?
What is that?
Rabbi Tam, the tefillin of Rabbi Tam. Is
Oh,
that
Rabbeinu
one of
Tam.
them?
I don't know if you would call that an enactment of the rabbis. He just argued with Rashi how exactly the
Yeah, but some people follow it.
of course. But that's not an enactment. That's just a typical argument between the rabbis how to interpret the Torah. That's just a typical, Robert.
Yeah, just from a historical perspective, there's no longer a Sanhedrin. Is that correct? It was from different times.
Right.
All right, and so consequently, and if it would be convened, it would be in Jerusalem, in Israel. It wouldn't be in Galus, right? Right, and there can never be, okay, so right now we don't have a Sanhedrin, but I know we have the chief Orthodox rabbi and we have a chief Sephardic rabbi in Israel, and they do make rulings that, if I understand correctly, will then be followed by either Ashkenazic or Sephardic Jews relative to that chief rabbi's position of being the leader worldwide of, again, Orthodox Jews relative to being, again, Ashkenazic or Sephardic. Is that pretty much?
Not exactly, and I'll tell you why. Okay. They don't have the same power that a real Sanhedrin would have, and they're definitely scholarly rabbis, and they're great rabbis. I believe almost all of the rabbis that Israel has had as chief rabbis have always been tremendous scholars, but they don't have the power that a real Sanhedrin would have, and therefore, I think they know their limitations. For example, there was a time when the rabbis wanted to abolish the idea of weddings costing so much money. And maybe about a decade ago, this was going on. Rabbis were getting all nervous because you have a lot of people that can't afford it. And everyone else is people who can afford it. They're making, $500,000 weddings. And you've got the poor people who are, struggling to make ends meet. And so they tried to make a rule, like you're not allowed to have more than this amount of guests and maybe more than this amount of musicians. And they wanted to make a rule, which made sense, that there should be some type of limit, and this way, you don't have to, it's not going to be an issue of everyone wants to outdo the other one, and then the poor people who also want to outdo, and then they're struggling, and then it ends up being it ends up being a big burden, number one, on people who are middle class, that they're overspending on the wedding, and then they end up having heart attacks, God forbid, for not being able to handle all their expenses. And then you have people who are poor, who they feel very left out and hurt. So there was a time, I don't think it worked out, but it was an interesting idea to establish a limit for the weddings. I'm just saying that I'm just sharing with you an example of a case where there are certain examples, and the Rambam brings it over here, that if the community doesn't accept it, it's too much for the community to accept. They can't handle it. So that's a rule that never takes hold. And that would be similar to what I'm telling you, that the chief rabbis, they know their limitations. You know what I mean? They know that it's not necessarily going to work unless there would be a consensus of rabbis throughout the world that want to agree on making such a decree. It's probably not gonna, it's not gonna hold.
I think we learned one in the beginning of the classes on Brochos, where the women didn't accept some law and didn't follow it. So it's really.
No, we actually learned a case where the women accepted more than what was expected according to the law.
Maybe it was that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, about the laws of Nida. Yeah, we mentioned the case where they accepted it upon themselves, and that became halacha. But in any event, the laws that the rabbis do establish, they have to be something that's doable. So, for example, if they would say everyone has to give 60% of their earnings to charity, it's not going to happen. That's a decree that they wouldn't be able to establish, because it won't be accepted amongst the people. I mean, some people maybe can handle that financially, but most people can't. So it's not going to be there are certain rules of how they have to, what fits in. They have to evaluate. The Rambam brings this in the same chapter, that they have to evaluate, is this something that's going to be accepted? But in any event, the point is that if you have a rule, like, for example, the case of medicine, where grinding medicine is prohibited on Shabbos. So the understanding was that the rabbis were nervous that this could lead, if we allow medicine on Shabbos, it would lead to people grinding and transgressing the prohibition of grinding on Shabbos, and therefore the rabbis prohibited medicine on Shabbos, unless it's a necessity. But there's a lot of people who take medicine not of necessity, but more for comfort, and the rabbis prohibited those type of medications. And the question is, would there be a later? Nowadays, we don't really make our own medicines, at least for the last century. Most of the medicines are made by chemists and in big companies, and they grind it. We don't grind our own medicine. So there could have been a consensus of rabbis, if they could have had a chief rabbi that said, nowadays that decree doesn't apply, and therefore we should be allowed to have Tylenol on Shabbos, or even with just a slight headache or a mild discomfort. We should be able to have, all different, maybe Tums on Shabbos, or other, little discomfort medicine, and on that. And the rabbis didn't do that. The rabbis did not get a consensus to abolish the ruling, the prohibition of medicine on Shabbos. So it's stuck, and it's still here today. And however, even though the rationale, which according to this Chassam Sofer, who's from the Rambam itself, it sounds like you could never abolish such a decree. But according to the Chassam Sofer, he says you could if the rationale behind it doesn't apply, which seemingly maybe doesn't apply. But so they could have, maybe, according to the Chassam Sofer, they could have, according to his understanding of this, they could have abolished it, but they didn't. Now, the reason why they didn't could be because, number one, they didn't feel that they are greater than the earlier rabbis to even think of doing something like that. It could also be that they felt that there are individuals that do still make their own concoctions, and which we definitely see today. Maybe they felt that it's not totally about the rationale is not totally wrong. A lot of people do grind up their own concoctions. They buy stuff from these from the stores that sell herbs, and then they grind it up and they make their own stuff. And so maybe there is reason to prohibit medication still, and they didn't feel that the rationale doesn't apply anymore. Might not apply on a big scale, but it still applies on a small scale. So that could be a reason why they didn't. But the point is that it's not easy to abolish a decree that the rabbis made. And as we mentioned also on Friday, based on Robert's question, that the rabbis do evaluate very, very well before they make a prohibition. Before they're going to establish a prohibition, they do have to evaluate very, very much. As the Rambam writes in this chapter 2 of Laws of Mamrim, he writes here, when a court sees it necessary to issue a decree, institute an edict, or establish a custom, they must first contemplate the matter and see whether or not the majority of the community can uphold the practice. We never issue a decree on the community unless the majority of the community can uphold the practice. So they have to really evaluate, is it really, after they already decide that it's a good thing, they have to see, was it something that people will be able to keep. Okay, so that really touches on the laws of establishing decrees. Now getting back to our Gemara. So we were mentioning on Friday about the issue of how to learn the Gemara, and the reason why our Gemara tells us that the bracha on shatisa, that's a loose shatisa, it's a watery shatisa, the bracha is shahakol. And we mentioned it's either because it's a drink or because it's medicine. So some rabbis learn this Gemara, some of the commentaries learn the Gemara, that the Gemara's main point here is that medicine loses its bracha. The other rabbis' commentaries on this Gemara learn that the Gemara mentions medicine here, but that's a side point. And the main point of our Gemara is that something you drink loses its regular bracha, and it ends up being a shahakol. So it's either because of medicine it turns into a shahakol, or because of drinking it turns into a shahakol. And each of these commentaries are exclusive, which means if they hold that it's because of medicine it's shahakol, that means that drinking something would not necessarily lose its bracha. And the ones that learn that drinking something make the bracha shahakol, they lower the blessing to a shahakol. According to them, medicine does not change the bracha. Something that's taken because of medicine purposes is not going to ruin the bracha. What ruins the bracha, what lessens the bracha, I shouldn't say ruin, but what lessens the bracha is the fact that it's drank. So you have these two mutually exclusive ways of learning the Gemara, which end up expressing themselves in halacha. I'll give you an example. In chapter 204 of the Shulchan Aruch, paragraph 11, so it mentions there about ground up different spices and mixed with honey, which the truth is we've learned a little about that before. So it mentions that the fruits and the herbs are the main thing. The honey is a secondary thing. Even if they're very ground up, and the Mishnah Brura here says, but you can still tell what they are. So you would make the bracha on these herbs or on these fruits, and you wouldn't say the bracha on the honey. Now, the Ramah adds in that anything that is not a food for healthy people, but it's eaten for medicine, the Ramah says the bracha would be shahak. Now, remember, this is the Ramah writing a note on Rabbi Yosef Kairo's statement. So Rabbi Yosef Kairo did not say this. He did not tell us that medicine would get a shahakol. Food eaten for medicine purposes gets a shahakol. He didn't say that. The Ramah adds in that anything eaten that's not eaten often, usual for healthy people, but it's eaten for refuah, for medicine purposes, the bracha would be shahakol. The Ramah adds this in. So what that means is that the Beis Yosef argues on this, and he would hold, no, medicine is not shahakol. Medicine would be similar to what he just wrote about, that when you grind up these herbs and put them with honey, the bracha would be on the herbs and not shahakol. So the Beis Yosef would argue here, and the Ramah is mentioning this. And if you look down in the Mishnah Brura here, the Mishnah Brura says this is a Ramah that we do not follow. And he says the Magen Avram and the other Achronim, the other opinions, agreed. One second. No, the wrong one. Let me read the right one. And look in the Bedek Habayis, he writes, look in this other sefer, this other book called Bedek Habayis, that writes that the majority of rabbinic authorities argue on this, and so agree all the Achronim, that you need to recite the bracha that's fitting for it because you are benefiting from it, even though it's medicine for medicine purposes, you're benefiting from it. So therefore you should recite the real bracha on it, not shahak. So what comes out from here is not only is the Rabbi Yosef Kairo saying this, but even though the Ramah adds in his view, the Mishnah Brura knocks it and says, no, the majority of the later opinions all knock this and say, we got to follow the same as Rabbi Yosef Kairo, and that is that anything that's taken as medicine for medicine purposes, if the bracha is not shahakal, like let's say it's some type of herb or some type of fruit, the bracha would stay, even though you're taking it for medicine. And what comes out, what that means is, how are they learning our Gemara? They're learning our Gemara that says the bracha is shahakal, not because medicine makes it a shahakal. According to halacha, the final halacha, the way they're learning our Gemara, is that the reason why our Gemara says shahakal is because it's a drink. And the drink is what's making it a shahakal. Again, there is ways of learning the Gemara that it's medicine that makes it a shahakal, but that's not the final way that we learn it according to halacha, meaning the accepted halacha follows the understanding of our Gemara that it's based on a drink that makes it a shahakal, not based on medicine. Although, keep in mind that the Ramah, who is actually my children's great-great-grandfather, he felt that you should worry about these views that also learn the Gemara differently, and that the bracha on anything eaten for medicine purposes would be a shahakal. Again,
Rabbi,
I have to just qualify what I just said, that specifically things that normally are not eaten by healthy people. That is where he says the bracha would change to a shahakal. And the reason he says that is because the case in our Gemara is a case where something is normally not eaten by healthy people, this loose shatisa, but it is food, and it could be eaten by healthy people. It's not a chemical. It's not dangerous for healthy people to eat. It's food. It's not a mold. It's food. It's something that people could eat, but it's not normally eaten by healthy people. And therefore, the bracha, according to the way they're learning our Gemara, would be shahakal on that. And the same thing would apply to anything similar in a similar situation, would be the same thing. Yes, David.
Yeah, I was going to say that yesterday I was looking in Me'am Lois for the Parsha, for Parshas Yisro, and he goes into all the details of the Aseret Dibros, and he goes into all the details of the blessings. And I happened to open to the page, and it says that the general rule is that all fruit juices have, this is from the same Orach Chaim 204. The general rule is that all fruit juices have the blessing of Shakol, with the exception of only grape juice and olive oil. And earlier he says that this is taken from 354. It's taken from Orach Chaim 202.4. He says that all fruit juices, the only exceptions are wine and olive oil, which when taken for medicinal purposes without bread has the blessing of Borei Pri Ha'etz, according to Orach Chaim 202.4. That's it.
Thank you, David, for bring that up. That's such divine providence that you saw that. Now, what David actually just said actually is a very strong question on what we learned. I don't know if anyone picked it up. I don't know if you picked it up yourself, David, but you're actually asking a question. Did you realize that?
No.
Oh, well, what you said was it's very challenging, because what you said was that we learned the Gemara earlier that says that if a person ate olive oil, what would the bracha be? And David just mentioned this. Person had olive oil, of course, mixed with other foods, but he's doing it for medicine. The bracha is bar pri ha'etz, right? Now, how does that fit with our Gemara here? According to the way of learning, that medicine makes the bracha shahako. So why did we say earlier that this anigroin, which is olive oil, would be a bar pri ha'etz? I've just proved myself all wrong. Right? And it's a Gemara before it. Even without David, what David mentioned, David just reminded us of that Gemara. But this seems to prove us all wrong. How does our Gemara understand medicine according to the way of learning that medicine gives it a bracha shahako? Why would that be that it would give it a bracha shahako if we said before that anigroin would be bari pri ha'etz? So, Susan, do you have an answer for this?
There are exceptions.
Yeah, but why? What would the exception be? What would the reason be?
I don't know exactly, but I remember you saying there's wine and olive oil are exceptions. But honestly, I don't remember, but I know there's exceptions.
Right. No, so what you're remembering is that wine and olive oil is an exception
for the blessings.
But that even though it's a liquid, it stays ha'etz. But once you jump to medicine, that should ruin that.
No.
The medicine should override. Logically, it should override it. Because even if it's something that really deserves ha'etz, like a fruit, the medicine, according to this view, would override that. So here also, you want to give it the ha'etz, but the medicine should then override it. I'm not sure who's first, Simone or Ben. I think Ben was first. Ben?
I wanted to say, I thought that the Gemara said one thing and Bet Yosef accepted it, but the Rama didn't.
No, the Gemara, there's no way to do that. You can't argue with the Gemara. There are different ways of understanding the Gemara. Okay. And the Beis Yosef picked one way to understand the Gemara. Right. In the Rama picked both ways. He wanted to follow both views and wanted to take the stringencies of both views, which is logical. He wants to cover all grounds. But since the majority of the rabbis felt that one view was the final view, that's why they seem not to accept the Rama's point. So, but really, there are two ways of learning the Gemara, and the Rama chose both to want to follow, at least as a way of stringency. Yes, Simone.
Yeah, I was going to say, didn't we say that Rav said that something could either be medicine or a drink? And that also there's this other idea of the fruits of Israel. So the fruits of Israel have a special status, which would include obviously olives and olive oil, but also I'm thinking pomegranates and pomegranate juice, which is another item that either can be a drink or it can be taken medicinally. In today's world, we think of sometimes think of pomegranate juice as a medicinal.
Okay, so you're sort of barking up Susan's alley and trying to say that that is why the bracha would stay, even though it's medicine. And then you're mentioning about pomegranate as a second point. So about the medicine point that, you know, since it's a fruit from Israel, that's sort of what Susan was mentioning, that olive oil is special. And what she meant was because it's a fruit from Israel. And the point is that is very nice that it's a fruit from Israel, but that gives it a bracha of the tree. I mean, it's not really because it's a fruit from Israel. Really, it really has to do with the fact that the honorable way of eating olives is the olive oil. The specialty of the olive tree is really the olive oil. That's really what it is. It's not necessarily because it's a fruit of Israel, but that's true. It has that extra special element to it. But the point is that if something's a medicine, it ruins its bracha. So even though you might want to keep the bracha and call this the fruit instead of the olives the fruit, because this is the honorable way of eating whatever's edible from the olive tree is the oil. So you want to call that the fruit, that's fine. Call it the fruit. And you can also be from Israel. But the fact is that if it's taken for medicine purposes, that should override it and ruin it. So that's really how we're asking this question.
Rabbi.
Just 1 second. Now, on your other point, Simone, about the pomegranate juice is going to be just like all other fruit juices, which is shahakol, even though it's from the fruit of Israel. So the fruit of Israel doesn't really change. It doesn't really have an effect on the fruit juices. It doesn't really change anything from anything about the fruit juices. The only thing unique about the fruit of Israel, the fruit juices of Israel, would be one view that I mentioned a week ago, and that was that date honey, one opinion says, because the verse says in it, date honey, doesn't say dates, that would mean that the date honey itself should be considered like ha'etz, like the date honey is the real thing that Israel is blessed with, not the dates. Or in addition to the dates, even the honey is because it says zavas, it says eretz zeis shemen dvash, so it uses the term honey instead of dates. So there is one view which we don't follow, but there is a view that says that the date, because our Gemara seems to argue with it. Our Gemara says that date honey is shahako, but there is a view that says that says date honey should be ha'etz, and how they reconcile that view with our Gemara, how that view reconciles with our Gemara is that view understands our Gemara to mean that you added water to the date honey, and that's how it became shahakol. That's why our Gemara says it's shahakol. But again, that's a very side view. That's not the accepted view. The accepted view is even date honey is shahakol. Everything is shahakol, even if it's from the 7 species. Okay, now Moshe, you wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Well, but you know what? I really want to answer my question. Is this about this? You want to answer the question because we're stuck now with the question.
No, I want to ask about Hagefen.
Okay, so then let me put you on hold for 1 second, Moshe. So to answer the question that we asked, that on Nigraim, we're saying the Gemara earlier said ha'etz, and I'm telling you there's a way to learn our Gemara that anything with medicine is shahako. The answer is that what we said here, that anything that's for medicine is shahako, is something that's mainly for healing, and it's not normally eaten by healthy people. That is where the bracha changes to shahako for medicine. But if something is often eaten by regular people as well, like a nigrain was a food eaten by regular people. Just this person happens to have a sore throat, so he's eating the anigrin for the olive oil. But the point is that the anigrin is something eaten by healthy people, and therefore the bracha on it would not change to shahako because it's not in this category. We're talking our category of that medicine makes something shahako is based on the fact that it's not eaten by regular on a normal basis. It's not a normal food. It's mainly medicine. Once in a while, a person will eat it. That's where it becomes shackle. So a nigrain does not fall into that category. So it's not a contradiction. Okay, now Moshe.
Okay, Rabbi, let's say Hagefen, I don't use any products, grape products other than iron, or grape juice. But what I'm trying to say is that supposing that there's a combination of lemon juice mixed with grape juice, where that's used for medicinal purposes, but the person's benefiting from the taste of it. Okay.
Right. Now,
does it remain Hagefen? At what point does it go from Hagefen to Shakol? Because once the lemon juice is put in there with the grape juice, and there's water, or they add water to it, and it's being used for medicinal purposes instead of being used for Hagefen, what is the point where it changes from that point? And then I have another question regarding.
Yeah, well, 1 second. So the thing is, with grape juice, it is a very complicated thing, and one of the things that grape juice itself is a big problem, because we've mentioned that grape juice is not exactly grapes that are crushed. Grape juice, they add a chemical that makes it not ferment anymore. So grape juice itself is questionable if the bracha would stay bari pri hagefen. Of course, we make bari pri hagefen on the grape juice, but it's not as simple as it sounds. And then once you start adding water to it, or other fruit or other juices, it creates it expands the question: does it retain its bracha? And it's complicated, because in the olden days they used to have much stronger wine and grape juice, and in those days they used to actually add 6 parts. It was either 5 or 6 parts of water into the wine, and the bracha would stay as long as you added up to that amount. The bracha would stay bari pri hagefen. Nowadays, our wine and grape juice does not fall into that category, and therefore the bracha would not would probably lose the bracha, depending on how much lemon juice you're adding. So if you're just adding a drop is one thing, but if you're adding more than that, you're gonna it's gonna mess up the bracha from bari pri hagefen. Okay, so what is your second question? We don't have a lot of time, so let's try to.
Well, it's
try to make this fast.
I'm talking about maybe products that are crushed grapes that are in like a bar that has like a kind of a goo in the middle of it for kids, for example, that might be, border, could that be, is that also eights, or does it become shakol,
Yeah, I'm not really sure what were the ingredients again? What is
grapes?
It?
Like they may have like grapes in it that are not quite. It's like it could even be like crushed grapes. But real fine crushed grapes, and it could be. These are. I guess these are kosher bars. I've seen them in some stores. Where there's crushed grapes, and then there's it's like a goo inside. Like a grape flavored goo or something in there that becomes. I think whatever you're talking about is probably artificial flavored. Are you sure it's not? But if it's not natural flavors in there, if there's natural flavors in there, natural juices.
Well, natural juices, the flavors. I don't know how much it is. How much natural juices do they put in these things? You know what I mean? Like if you have seltzer with some grape flavor or something, right. I doubt it that would. It just means that it has a slight tinge of some flavor. That's not grape juice. That's not. It's definitely not bari pri hagefen. But I don't know what food you're talking about. But anyway, okay, Simone, did you have a question, or your hand's still up from before? Okay, I guess it's still up from before. Okay, let's go further. So we were talking about the Gemara here with the 2 ways of learning it, and so what comes out is that we had a question by Rabbi Yosef that he felt that how could Rav say that this shatisa is shahakol because of medicine purposes? Rav said that we see on Shabbos you're allowed to mix this shatisa. He calls it shatus, and you would be allowed to have it on Shabbos, and it must not be for medicine purposes. Now, Tosfos over here, I want to mention, Tosfos is bothered with, so what was the Gemara thinking in the beginning? And what was the change? How did these opinions, in other words, Rabbi Yosef had a question on Rav, and Abaye is answering it. Now, whenever you have a question and an answer, what changed between the question and the answer? Was it the law? Is it a different law? Like he had the law wrong, or did he have the case wrong? What was the situation? So the way Tosfos understands it, he says when Rabbi Yosef asked this question, the question was based on the case is that the main ingredient is medicine. The main point of eating this is medicine, and you don't normally eat it as food. And because of that, something that is normally medicine and is not regularly eaten as food, Rabbi Yosef held that would make it prohibited on Shabbos. Now, Abaye argues on that. Abaye answers that and says, no, even something that's mainly medicine and not normally eaten as food, but it is a food and it could be eaten as food, but it's not normally eaten as food, that doesn't ruin it from it being permitted on Shabbos. Because he learns from the word, kol ha'eichlin, all foods, anything that's a food, even though it's not normally eaten as a food, but it says all eichlin, all foods, a person could eat even if it's for medicine purposes. And even if it's mainly for medicine purposes, and that's why most people eat it. But since once in a while you could eat it as it is a food, once in a while people eat it as a food, that's permissible on Shabbos. So they're arguing you have to first know what the case is. The case is that it's mainly medicine and it's only once in a while eaten as food. And the argument between Rabbi Yosef and Abaye was, what is that? What is the ruling on such an item on Shabbos? And Rabbi Abaye proves it from a Mishnah, and it's from the extra word in the Mishnah that says, Carl, all foods, even foods that are mainly medicine, but once in a while they're eaten as food. That's considered permissible on Shabbos, and that's how Tosfos explains the beginning of the Gemara to the end of the Gemara. In other words, what was the question? What was the answer? And now we're up to the Gemara where it says Utsricha. And Utsricha is about 18 lines up from the bottom of the page. Utsricha. Utsricha de Rav Ushmuel. Or it's questionable if the word Shmuel should be in there or not. So Utsricha de Rav. In Rav's law, that Shatisa is Shahakol is necessary. The reason why Rav's law is necessary, that Shatisa is Shahakol, the imehai, because if we would learn it from the brisa that says that you're allowed to mix with a spoon the shatus on Shabbos, if you would learn it from there, havo amina, I would have thought la'achila kamachavin, that when a person is taking it, it looks like he's eating it, looks like his intent is to eat it. Urafua memelo kahavya, and the healing that it does have medicine purposes. In fact, most people do drink this for medicine, but the medicine is a side. It happens automatically. It's a fringe benefit. Aval hacha, but here regarding the laws of bracha, kivan de lachatchila l'rafua kamachavin, here we are concentrating on the fact that what is he eating it for? What is his purpose? The purpose of his eating it. Now on Shabbos, the person's taking it, it looks like he's eating it. When he's taking it for, what is his intent? What his intent is for medicine. Now, if his intent is for medicine, we would think, we would not make a bracha at all on it. His intent is for medicine. I would think maybe you don't make a bracha at all. Kamash Malon comes and lets us hear. Rav comes and lets us hear. Kivan de'islei hana mine ba'i bruche. Since he does have benefit from this this item, this food item that's also a medicine, mainly a medicine, but you are getting a enjoyment from it. Therefore, it needs a bracha. So you're drinking something for medicine purposes, but you are benefiting from it. But the bracha is not the main bracha. What it should be, maybe mezainis. The bracha is a shahakol, and on this, the Gemara's the commentaries debate in why is the bracha shahakol, either because it's medicine or because it's a drink. Now, on Tosfos over here on the side, he mentions an interesting thing. He mentions that the reason why the bracha is shahakol, he says, is because it's not made lisoid. Lisoid means to satisfy. It's not made to satisfy, rather to drink. He adds that word satisfy in, and I mentioned this on Friday, that when we say something is meant to drink, where does that, what category does that, where do you draw the line? If something is eaten with a spoon, would that be where you draw the line? How thick would something, what would make something not considered a drink, but considered a food? And so this is, this Tosfos adds an interesting point to this argument, or to this question. And he says that the main point is it satisfying? That's what would make something not a drink, but considered more like a food. So if you drink your oatmeal, let's say your oatmeal is like farina, is like a liquidy farina, and it's drinkable, but it is satisfying. That would not be a drink that you would say shahakol, because it's a satisfying food. So this would be, this is an important point, because we're talking about liquids, drinks, but even drinks, where do you draw the line? What's a drink? How liquidy does it need to be considered a drink? And here Tosfos gives us a point of lisoid. And I showed you on Friday that the Alter Rebbe makes this as an important factor, lisoid. Okay, and maybe on tomorrow, Yetz Hashem, I'll bring you what the Shulchan Aruch says. Okay,
Rabbi,
we're going to conclude here. Yes, David.
I had a question when I was in yeshiva. What's the after blessing? How much do you need for an after blessing for ice cream? Is ice cream considered a solid, or is it a liquid? If it's a solid, you need an ounce, and if it's a liquid, you need like 3.5 ounces. So the Rosh Yeshiva said to me, if you can eat the ice cream with a fork, then it's a solid, and if you can't because it's running through the fork, then it's considered a liquid.
Okay, we'll have to talk about that tomorrow as well. Okay,
Rabbi?
Very interesting. Yes, which rabbi, by the way? 1 second, David, which rabbi was that?
You.
No, that was Rabbi Yaakov Koppel Goldberg, the Rosh
Rabbi
Yeshiva
Goldberg.
from
wow.
Hadar Torah.
Okay, he's a great scholar. Okay, yeah, tremendous scholar. Yes, Susan. Yeah, we can't hear you.
Simone. It was Simone.
It was me.
Oh, Simone. Okay, Simone.
So I don't know if this is going to satisfy you, but I went back to Moshe's question earlier and I looked it up, and it says here that you can mix Concord grape juice, 2 parts water to 1 part grape juice for Kiddush, or with wine, you can add 1 part water to 1 part wine. That's from the Yeshiva Har Etzion in the Gush.
Okay, that is a good source. It's authoritative. It's definitely a scholarly source. I don't know if all rabbis agree with that. That's definitely something, Moshe, if you want to follow that, it's acceptable. Okay, everyone, have a wonderful day. Sei gesund.
Thank you, Rebbe.
Thank
See you
you.
later.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.